There are games you remember clearly, and then there are games you remember encountering. Nightmare Creatures sits firmly in the second category. I don't remember finishing it. I don't remember learning its systems. I don't remember characters, bosses or story beats. What I remember is the idea of it, a glimpse, a demo disc moment, a few minutes in the dark before moving on to something else. It was too murky, too awkward, too unfamiliar at the time when I was still trying to make sense of fully 3D games. I gravitated towards fixed camera angles, towards certainty, towards games that frame the experience for me instead of asking me to wrestle with it. Nightmare Creatures didn't do that. It dropped you in the shadow, handed you a weapon and expected you to figure it out. And as a kid, I didn't, so I left. And that's where the memory ended, which makes coming back now interesting. Because looking at it today, with decades of context behind me, something very different jumps out. This doesn't look like a forgotten curiosity. This looks like an ambition. Gothic streets, oppressive darkness, monsters emerging from fog and shadow, a camera that feels heavy rather than cinematic. It feels like a game reaching for something that wouldn't fully exist yet. Not polished, not refined, but clearly aimed somewhere. And suddenly, a thought I didn't expect crept in. This feels like Bloodborne, not mechanically, not spiritually, but emotionally. Not influence, not lineage, just coincidence. A familiar hunger for atmosphere, for dread, for a world that doesn't want you there. And that's fascinating, because Nightmare Creatures isn't remembered as a defining horror game. It's remembered, if at all, as a rough one. A cult title, a footnote, a game people vaguely recall being hard or janky or too dark. But now that the PSX index has slowed me down enough to really look at it, I'm starting to wonder if it wasn't wrong, just early. This episode isn't about nostalgia, it isn't about rediscovery, and it isn't about defending a forgotten classic. It's about finally stopping long enough to ask, what was Nightmare Creatures trying to be? And did the PlayStation 1 let it get there?
Callisto Entertainment presents
Welcome back to the PSX Index. I'm Parascreen, and this is one of the ones I walked past, until now. The first thing Nightmare Creatures does is make sure you don't feel welcome. Not in a dramatic way, not with a jump scare or a cinematic introduction, just discomfort. The streets are dark, not moody dark, practical dark. The kind of dark where you're not sure if you're missing something or if the game simply doesn't want to show it to you. The camera sits behind you, heavy and stubborn. It doesn't glide, it doesn't frame moments. It follows reluctantly, and immediately you feel the age of the design. Movement has weight, turning takes commitment, attacks don't cancel cleanly. Every swing feels like you've signed a contract you're now obliged to honour, which at first feels wrong. Coming off Disney's careful clarity, this feels hostile by comparison. No gentle onboarding, no readable language, no reassurance that you're doing the right thing. Enemies emerge suddenly, sometimes from places you didn't expect. Sometimes from places you absolutely should have been watching. And when combat starts, it doesn't feel heroic. It feels scrappy. You're not dancing around enemies. You're trading space, testing distance, trying to figure out what the game considers a mistake. Hits land with a thud, not a flourish. Misses feel costly, and the feedback loop is blunt. There's no elegant rhythm here yet, just friction. And here's the important part, that friction doesn't feel accidental, it feels intentional, even if the tools available at the time couldn't fully support it. Nightmare Creatures wants you to feel vulnerable, it wants movement to feel heavy, it wants combat to feel dangerous instead of empowering. It's not trying to be fun first, it's trying to be oppressive, which suddenly makes that old demo disc memory make sense. This wasn't something you casually sampled and moved on from because it was boring. You moved on because it asked too much of you too quickly. And now, older, calmer, and more patient. That demands lands differently. I'm no longer trying to master it immediately, I'm trying to understand it. And once you slow down enough to meet it on its own terms, you start to see what it's aiming for. Combat in Nightmare Creatures is where the game reveals its biggest contradiction. It wants you to fight like a survivor, but it gives you the tools of an action game. On paper, this should feel empowering. You've got weapons, you've got combos, you've got enemies that look like they're begging to be put down. In practice, every fight feels like you're slightly under-equipped for the situation you're in. Attacks have wind-up, recovery is slow, positioning matters more than aggression. You don't rush enemies, you approach them cautiously, baiting movement, testing range, backing off when things feel wrong, and the game never tells you that's what it wants. You just learn the hard way. Enemies don't politely wait their turn, they lunge, they flank, they soak hits longer than you'd expect. Sometimes they go down quickly, sometimes they don't. And that inconsistency is stressful, but also weirdly effective, because you never feel fully in control. This isn't the clean, readable combat of later horror action games. There's no graceful dodge, no invisibility window you can rely on, just timing, spacing, and hope. And there's where the intent starts to show through the roughness. Nightmare Creatures isn't interested in making you feel powerful, it's interested in making you feel exposed. Every encounter carries the risk of going wrong, not because you made a flashy mistake, but because you committed to an action a fraction too early. That heaviness people complain about, that's the point. The problem is execution. The hit detection isn't always clear. The camera doesn't always cooperate. Enemy tells can be subtle to the point of invisibility. So when things go wrong, it's not always obvious why, and that's where frustration creeps in. You're never quite sure whether you failed, or whether the game simply didn't communicate its rules well enough. But even in those moments, there's something admirable happening. Nightmare Creatures is reaching for a kind of tension most games of this era weren't ready for yet. It wants combat to feel like risk management, like attrition, like survival, not spectacle. And while it doesn't always succeed, it never backs down from that goal, which is why, even when it stumbles, it never feels trivial. You don't mash your way through Nightmare Creatures, you endure it, and that endurance becomes part of the experience. The world of Nightmare Creatures doesn't guide you, it doesn't flame itself, it doesn't pause to show you the landmarks, it doesn't care if you understand where you are. You're dropped in the dark. Narrow streets that loop and branch without much visual distinction. Stone textures blur together. Doorways look important until they aren't. Corners hide enemies or nothing at all. And the game never steps in to help you read it. There's no map gently nudging you forward. No cinematic camera sweep saying, this way. You learn the city the hard way, by getting turned around, by backtracking, by realising you've walked past the same stretch of street 3 times without noticing. At first, this feels like bad design, and sometimes it probably is. But there's also something quietly effective happening here. The city doesn't feel built for you, it feels built to spite you. This isn't a place designed for traversal or spectacle, it's a place designed to feel hostile, unfamiliar and vaguely uncaring, which makes movement feel tense even when nothing is happening. You're always scanning the darkness, listening for sounds, second guessing whether the path is safe or just empty, and when enemies do appear, they don't feel staged, they feel like they belong here. They emerge from the same shadows you've been staring into, making the environment itself feel complicit in the threat. This is where the game's ambition really shows. Nightmare Creatures isn't trying to scare you with sudden shocks, it's trying to wear you down, to make the act of existing in its world feel uneasy. And again, the tools don't always support the goal. Draw distance is limited, lighting is inconsistent, the camera can work against you, but the intent is clear. The city isn't meant to be conquered, it's meant to be survived, which makes getting lost less like a mistake and more like part of the experience. You're not exploring a space designed to be understood, you're stumbling through a place that doesn't care if you make it out. And that's something very few PS1 games were even attempting at the time.
He works alone, his hands defiling the his thirst for knowledge and power. His name is Adam Crowley, a man who was once respected in the field of science until fate led him along another path.
Nightmare Creatures feels like a game that arrived before anyone had quite agreed on the rules. Not just the rules of horror, but the rules of how 3D action games were supposed to feel. It sits in an awkward space. It's not survival horror in the Resident Evil sense. There's no careful pacing, no puzzle-heavy structure, no fixed camera angle safety net. But it's not a full-blown action game either. It doesn't give you the fluidity or responsiveness that genre expects. So it ends up somewhere in the middle, and that in-between is probably why it never settled into wider conversation. Players who wanted clean action found it stiff. Players who wanted structured horror found it unruly. Nightmare Creatures didn't compromise. It demanded patience at a time when patience wasn't a given. And looking back now, that feels less like a failure and more like a timing issue. The ideas were there: weighty combat, environmental hostility, atmosphere over empowerment, monsters as obstacles, not set pieces. But the language to support those ideas, smoother cameras, clearer feedback, better control standards, simply didn't exist yet. So the game asks you to do a lot of interpretive work, to forgive the rough edges, to read intention through limitation, which is a hard sell, especially when the PlayStation was filling up with games that felt more immediately rewarding. And yeah, that friction is exactly what makes Nightmare Creatures interesting now, because playing it today, without nostalgia clouding judgment, you can see both sides clearly. You can feel why it pushed people away, and you can feel why it stuck with a small group of players anyway. It wasn't trying to be friendly, it wasn't trying to be accessible, it was trying to be oppressive. And that choice, even when it doesn't fully land, gives the game an identity that hasn't completely faded. Nightmare Creatures didn't become a classic, but it didn't disappear either. It lingered as a rumour, a memory, a game people remember the idea of more than the experience itself. And maybe that's exactly where it belongs. Playing Nightmare Creatures now doesn't feel like rediscovery, it feels like correction, not of the game, but of the space I left unexplored. This isn't a title that suddenly reveals itself as a misunderstood genius. It's still rough, still awkward, still demanding in ways that aren't always fair, but it's also unmistakably trying to make atmosphere matter more than comfort, trying to make combat feel dangerous rather than empowering, trying to create a world that presses back at you instead of accommodating you. And that matters, because the PSX Index isn't about finding classics everywhere you look. It's about understanding why the library looks the way it does, why some games become landmarks, why others become footnotes, and why a few exist somewhere in between, not forgotten, not celebrated, just unresolved. Nightmare Creatures sits squarely in the middle space. I understand now why I didn't stay with it back then. It asked too much of me at the wrong time, but I also understand why it never quite went away. There's ambition here that didn't quite have a language yet, ideas that would have eventually resurfaced elsewhere, better supported, better refined. This wasn't the future of horror action, but it was reaching for it, and that reach is worth documenting. Index entry 40 is complete. That brings us 40 games down into the PSX Index, 1,238 to go, and with each blind spot filled in, the picture gets a little clearer, not just of the console, but of the paths gaming tried, abandoned, and sometimes circled back 2 years later. Next time, we stay in unfamiliar territory, another first encounter with a game I'd never even heard of. Index entry 41, Ryzen Zan, the Samurai Gunman, a title that sounds like it shouldn't exist, and somehow it does. This has been Parasine. Next time, the PlayStation 1 asks a question it probably shouldn't. What if a samurai had a gun?